Why, hello there. I'm excited to share with you a really great chat I had with lead designer Sherwin Matthews about the upcoming Elden Ring board game. The Elden Ring board game is being published by Steamforged Games and has a Kickstarter campaign launching on November 22nd, which is just a day or so away at the time I'm recording this. Sherwin and I cover so many topics that I actually broke it into two videos, with this being the first and covering topics such as an overview of what the game is about, the details and concepts behind exploration and combat, as well as some cool information about the open world Kickstarter campaign and what that entails. You will find links in the description to the Kickstarter campaign as well as the designer diaries that Sherwin and I reference, and with that, let's get into it. Have you played through Elden Ring a whole bunch, or what's your experience with Elden Ring in particular?
Yeah, the honest way of saying that is just a little bit. And when I
Yeah.
say just a little bit, that's obviously some degree of sarcasm there. Like I've played a bunch of Elden Ring, as you can imagine.
When you were approaching the Elden Ring board game, as you mentioned, you started fresh. You weren't iterating on the Dark Souls board game or anything else. You were looking at it as its own thing. I'm curious the sort of the intersection or what level of the board game design was in the one part, another take on the similarities of the Souls Elden Ring combat, which are still stamina based, and there is a lot of similarities, and
Mm.
also how much you were trying to also highlight some of the many like pretty fundamental differences in how Elden Ring works. Like, how did each of those weigh in the experience of designing it?
Yeah, really good question. So one of the elements that's most important for understanding Dark Souls, and I am simplifying a little bit, so I will apologize in advance, but Dark Souls, the experience of playing it, there's far less exploration as much as generally it tends to be combat situation to combat situation to combat situation. You know,
Yeah.
there's some small sections where perhaps you're not having something thrown at you and trying to kill you, but for the most part, you're literally going from fight to fight to fight, and you're battering your way across the level.
Yeah.
Over half of Elden Ring is riding around exploring. You know, it's seeing. Yeah, to think about the first touch point you probably had with Elden Ring. You're watching a trailer, whether that's a trailer or playing the game. The first thing you saw was this big, expansive horizon where you immediately go, "Wow, I want to go explore what's over there." There's this whole world that you want to go and see. I know everyone was talking about how the open world elements, yeah, there's a massive hook to what Elden Ring was from the very earliest point, and that's something which we didn't want to ignore when we actually sat down and made Elden Ring, because obviously we could make a very similar engine to Dark Souls where it's lots of fighting, lots and lots of fighting, and we abstract away the exploration. But that wouldn't necessarily be the most um it wouldn't be very intuitive to someone who's played the game and really loves Elden Ring and understanding what their experience is. We wanted to have something where people can go out and explore the land, and they do sort of see across the horizon and they do discover new areas. And that stepping into the unknown is a big element of what we wanted to do. Now, obviously, that influenced our decision of how do we then match that with combat. And here's an interesting point that we kind of landed at, which is one of the things after I played Elden Ring for a short while, something that I found amazing about the game was the elegance of how it went from I am exploring the land and I am discovering all sorts of new things. I'm riding along the torrent, and then the moment I get into combat, that horizon shrinks and disappears. Suddenly now it's literally this tunnel vision of me in a duel with whatever it is I'm fighting. And
Yeah.
the example I always give to everybody is the Gatefront Ruins. It's the first time you really see a lot of that stuff in the game. And now I'm literally fighting the Godric Knight, and the Godric Knight is there, and I'm watching for tells. I'm looking for how the distance between us. I'm looking at attack animations, my own as well as the enemies. I'm looking for openings that I can attack and so on, and think about how to do it. If I'm backing off too much, I'm watching his behavior. I'm also concerned that I'm going to get jumped from behind by bats or something or other if night falls, that sort of stuff. All of those elements are going through my head, but crucially, I am in a one-on-one duel, and suddenly I've forgotten that landscape that I was exploring. But here's the thing: it's still there. This is part of the elegance of what Elden Ring does. It doesn't have like that Pokemon-esque kind of spiral, and suddenly now I'm on a mat somewhere fighting it. This idea of it's the same world, and that's something we wanted to implement into this game more so than the combat orientation of what we found with something like Dark Souls, where it's very much like a combat arena game. We wanted to make people feel that they had that intimate personal combat kind of feel against an
Yeah.
enemy, and they were in a duel, because that's a big part of how it plays. And that very much influenced the decision to use quest books. So each individual player has their own quest book, so that way they have their own personal touch for how they experience combat, which obviously leads us into things like summoning into someone's book if if you need help, and that feels quite thematically nice as well, obviously. And
Yeah.
then the same again when you fight the bosses and you push all the books together to make a playing space, because ultimately it's cooperative and that's what you're going to go do.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. That leads well into I was curious about that because I had noticed in the designer diaries that there's the mention of co-op, but I also noticed looking at images from the videos and stuff that you guys have uploaded that you have players sort of spreading out too. So I was curious about the balance between
Hmm.
how can you act as a player individually as well as when does is it a party experience or are you adventurers who come together at certain points? Like what's sort of the balance of that?
Yeah, so the game is completely cooperative. So there's no co-op, there's no PvP whatsoever in the game. It is something where it's very much a party experience. So you are working together to achieve the goals that you're set, and objectives and narrative and story arc are all set by these Guidance for Grace cards, Guidance for Grace deck, which is fixed for each quest, although you can find lots of little side quests, and there's also there's branching points for each of the quests. So if you progress along and you choose to go do one thing, then perhaps that means that you sort of close off another avenue, and that's how the game evolves effectively. But the overarching narrative of each quest is given to you by Guidance for Grace cards, and the players all work together to achieve those goals. But at the same time, players are all controlling their own individual tarnish. They're exploring across the land in any order they want to go, and they're exploring out and doing their own activities as they work towards what those goals are. So there's this sense around the table, and this has been really nice actually sitting down with reviewers this past week to actually play it, where people have sat down and go, okay, we are working individually, but we love talking about what's happening around the table. Like, hey, if I go over there and kill this enemy, then you can go over there and do this thing. Or we have something in the games where on one of the hex tiles, if there's an enemy, you have to fight the enemy before you can interact with the other locations on that tile. But at the same time, if someone's fighting that enemy, then someone else can sneak past and
Oh,
go get the materials or whatever else, right? So
yeah.
I see players who are a bit wounded, their tarnish is wounded. I don't want to rest at a site of grace and reset everything. So you go fight that guy, and then go fight the enemies there. I'll sneak in and grab that thing we need, and then I'll get back out again. That sort of stuff, and that's awesome to see because ultimately, when you're playing a tabletop game, it's the social contract that pulls people in.
Yeah.
It's that experience of hey, we're working together to play this and overcome it. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts about any tabletop game we've ever made. To be honest, is
Yeah.
the part where we give people a new way to celebrate and experience and enjoy their favorite game.
Yeah.
Is the best way
Yeah.
of saying it.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, so it's just a clarification of my own interest as well as probably
Yeah,
people
sure.
listening is so you can engage in a typical combat by yourself if you want to. So I was curious because one thing for me as a player and one thing is my interest is how designers approach it is like what's the level of downtime versus like are you doing something on other players' turns? Are you sitting around? Like how's that sort of play out for you?
No, so the two things that we honed into quite a lot, purely the two things outside of the Elden Ring experience that we honed in quite a lot with this and wanted to keep control is one is setup time. So we make it so that people don't spend a couple of hours setting this
Mm,
thing up ready to go.
yeah.
And then the other one is downtime. Um, the worst experience in the world is when, yeah, let's say there's you, me, and a couple other people sitting there playing this game, and you jump into combat, and then someone goes, "Okay, I'm gonna go make a cup of tea for everybody," and the other guy's like pulls out his phone, starts updating his socials or whatever else,
Yeah.
click playing Elden Ring, that sort of stuff. That's the worst thing ever because at that point people are just disconnecting away from what the game is, and we want
Yeah.
this thing to be immersive. We want it to be very fast paced. We want people to be constantly engaged with what's going on. We use a three action system. The three action system is whether you're is your turn economy, and that doesn't matter whether you're exploring, you get three actions, whether you're in combat, you get three actions.
Mm,
Combat is designed to be played as part of effectively as a player order as you go around. Yeah, let's say if you jump into combat, then what you're going to be doing is your turn ends. You'll be then setting up your combat grid. So you'll open up your book, you'll put in the enemies that are on it, you'll shuffle the marching order and lay that out, which is your initiative, so you know what order everyone's going next turn. We will play our turns while that's happening. Gets to you, you'll play a round of combat in which every enemy on the mat is and on the grid is going to actually move and make an attack or do whatever it is that they do. At which point your turn is over, comes next to me. And turns, irrespective of whether you're exploring or fighting a round of combat, should be somewhere in the region of 1 to 2 minutes at very most. Oftentimes they're more like sort of 30 to 60 seconds. So very, very
yeah.
fast to blast through. means that we don't have downtime while we wait for you to go kill an enemy, and it takes 20 minutes doing it.
That sounds great. Yeah, because yeah, like you said, you don't want that huge downtime, but I do like that you have this balance of working together. But like you said, sort of, oh, I'll go here and do this, and maybe they'll sneak in. I think that sounds wicked cool. So that's good. And sort of in a general sense, we've touched on a number of it, aspects of it. But you said 90 to 120 minutes is the typical playtime for a session. What's the format of a session? If you were to like, what well, I guess what determines the end of a session? Is it the quests, or how's that work?
Yeah, it's a really. I should probably start on a point there. There's a really interesting thing that happened, and I'll be the very first to own up to hold up my hands to this. So one of the things that we normally do when we're looking at sessions is we'll time our team playing a game, and
Mhm.
because we need to know how long the game plays, we want to put that on the box and say, this is how long it takes to play it. One of the things that we oftentimes get wrong is we forget we are a team of game designers sitting in a studio. It's our job to play games. We get things fairly quickly because
Yeah.
we're not smarter than the average bear. We've just played a lot more games than the average bear. And it's just something where, as you can imagine, it's like anything where that's your field of expertise. And our guys sitting down were like, well, we're playing through this demo, and I'll take very specifically the demo we made for showing to press at the showcase onwards. We were sitting blasting through that, and we're like, okay, it takes about 60 minutes, 60 minutes or so, half hour exploring, half hour fighting the boss, whatever. I sat down to record that with a couple of the guys, a couple of the press guys, and 3 hours later we finished, and I was like, wow, we play a lot faster than the average bear. Like, we play a lot faster because we know the rules. And granted, we're just obviously topping to talk to explain rules and bits and pieces, but at the same time, I realize the social contract I mentioned is the part that we're missing. And also, people are just really immersing themselves and throwing them into exploring the world and doing all sorts of interesting stuff. So that playtime, I'd say, is 120 minutes plus at this point. It seems like the fairest one. I that's probably the first time I've said that out loud. So that's absolutely an exclusive for you. That's me holding up my hands and going, do you know what? That time is probably not as indicative as it could be. But to actually answer your question, so very much the game is a campaign game. You could, I guess, do it as a standalone, and that might be something that we look to include as a section in the rulebook and like an alternate play mode. But really, it's a campaign experience, And this is something where we divide it into sessions, and a session is effectively a main quest, and that's really where you're going to embark across upon a literal page in the book, which will tell you whether it's exploration quests and you're exploring across a bunch of hex tiles to find certain locations in order to progress your campaign. It could be that you're playing a standard, well, what's called a standard at the moment quest, where after doing that, you then go into a dungeon and then fight a boss of some description. The aforementioned misbegotten, perhaps. But the point is that that's not the standard. The exploration is very similar to that, but it doesn't have the boss component at the end. There are gauntlet quests, and those are things where you literally just have a series of combat encounters as you go through. There's something like the Limgrave Tunnels or whatever else. And then there are narrative quests where they're more like a choose your own adventure that you're going to go through, and that might be interspersed with arena combat, and then come back out again, a bit more narrative, and then come somewhere else. So that session can really wildly change, especially because you are drawing different, you are finding NPCs who will give you side quests and try to make you off the beaten path or whatever. So lots of
Perfect.
things like that.
One of the questions I had was, it sounds so this is a campaign thing, but there may be potential for rules for like a one-off if you want to bring some friends over, sort of see if you can get them into a larger experience or something by sort of pitching it to them.
Well, the game is, because we always design our campaigns as standalone, as session games. It is something where, let's say, that again, the two of us sit down, start playing. Yeah, that's how we begin. If you have another couple of people who can sort of join us for a session, then they can literally be parachuted into this. They'll very quickly get their own tarnish. They can join us on our quest. We can level them up a bit to match where we are. And if they then play and one of them says, oh, this is fantastic, joins our team for the rest of the game, and the other one, the rest of the campaign, the other one's like, not for me, steps out. That's fine. People can drop in and out of that campaign as you go. So it can almost be something where if your friends aren't sure, they can jump in, experience it, and then drop out or carry on playing as suits.
Perfect.
The game will scale around the amount of players at the start of the session. So.
And I think one basic element of the game that probably is worthy of an overview is, it seems like the main driver is this series of these hex tiles that you're laying out. And just if you could speak a moment about those, because I know those lean toward sort of, it's not a map of Elden Ring in the traditional sense, but it's tapping into the aesthetic looks very similar. And also just, you come across various things when you're playing the game, like ruins and stuff. Could you just give an overview of like what a hex grid would look like and how that sort of exploration as that main driver sort of works in the game?
Sure. I mean, one of the hex exploration is a really interesting and strangely captivating mechanic in board games. There's something about it that just feels cool as you're playing things down, right?
Yeah.
But what the way that the exactly as you say, that the aesthetic is going to match the overworld map for Elden Ring, because obviously that's a big resonance that we want everyone to be able to pick up on and understand. In terms of how it works, is that you'll explore through that map. In terms of the shape of it and so on, that's going to determine whatever direction the player's going. There are some barriers which represent either a wall that you can't get over or a cliff edge or whatever else you have to go around. But ultimately, how you explore and the shape of it is going to be up to you. There are set amount of tiles for each quest, like the exploration quest. So, you can't just endlessly run across the entire map and off the side of the table you're playing on. There is a point where there will be a limit to that. And there are some areas that you can't access unless you find a map fragment that you need to grab and then start laying down additional tiles because you access the new ones. Or maybe even an extra area where you go up or down an elevator and suddenly you find yourself in a new area with another hex grid off to one side. So there's lots of bits and pieces where we mix around with that and we have some fun playing around with how that might look. But in terms of one of the key things we wanted to do is our very early conversation we had was, and I think I mentioned this one of the developer diaries, is, hey, so do we make this so it's a one-to-one? Do we make this so that, let's say we're going towards the Groveside Cave, do we want players who've played a whole bunch of Elden Ring to recognize that and go, oh, I know if I go over here, I'm going to find X, Y, Z, and I'll know the location of everything? Is that the key part? Well, it celebrates what the players know about the game, which is really cool. And it's a nice nod. So they go, I'm rewarded for my knowledge. Brilliant. But there's an interesting thing that happens with a lot of video games. And Elden Ring is no different, where the first time you play it, there's a sense of wonderment of, I don't know what's happening. I'm stepping into the unknown. I'm discovering things for the first time, and that's cool. And then once you've been there, whether it's a familiar location, you've played the game and you're playing it through again as New Game Plus or whatever, now you're speed running because you know where everything is, and now you're just blasting through. I don't need to go there. There's nothing useful there, or no, I don't, or yes, I need to go there. I'm trying to do it the most efficient way possible, which is cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I always want to do is emulate this idea of, let's get that first feeling every single time you play. Let's make it so that anytime you sit down to play, you're like, whoa, I'm stepping into the known, and that's cool.
Yeah.
So that's the point where we went, well, let's not procedurally generate. Yeah, sorry, not quite procedurally generate, but let's randomize a lot of the locations in terms of how this works. I don't want people to play this and head in for the Groveside Cave and see a whole bunch of stuff like, I don't know, Stormvale Castle and, Castle Morn or whatever, and find these things and go, why is that here? That shouldn't be anywhere near here, for example. That's wrong. But at the same time, I do like the idea that, hey, this wooded area, that's not near the cave anymore. That's off to the east or off to the west or whatever else. Stuff where you've got your start point and your end point are familiar, but the spaces in between, I think, are really interesting to play around with, because that gives people different ideas about how they could do it. And meeting characters in slightly odd places, like, for example, meeting Patches on the way there or whatever else, that's kind of interesting and cool, because that's the bit where players go, oh, I recognize this familiar face. That's interesting. And it feels like their journey at that point, their adventure. It's a unique thing to them. And I think that's something which is really, really important to drill into. Because again, as I've talked to you about before, a lot of what we make is a tabletop adaptation, which gives you the feeling of playing that game and wants you to go, this feels exactly like what I love, but at the same time, different enough. This is really cool. Like, I've it's enough nods to the fans that we go, okay, I love playing this stuff. This is awesome. So
the combat system is pretty interesting, I think. Like, I've obviously, as someone who's into board games as well as a big Souls fan, I've thought over the years of like, oh, how would that maybe work on a tabletop setting? And the setting you've chosen is something I've sort of wondered about before myself, which is sort of abstracting, but also keying right into how far you are from the enemy, because that's such a big part, is your spatial awareness. So just for, if you could give a brief overview of sort of how the combat situations sort of play out, at least on a broad level.
Sure. I mean, each of our combats play out on a battlefield grid, and the battlefield grid not only represents the spatial awareness around you and the actual space around where you're moving, but it also represents your stances. Are you in aggressive stance where you've dropped in something and you're pressing the attack? Are you neutral where you're surveying the battlefield? Is this something where you're in a defensive stance and you're gaining stamina and obviously you're shield up or whatever? and doing that. And this is something where that's a key part of the combat that you'll have. Is the stance you're in will dictate what your footing is for the round of combat ahead of you, or the rounds, plural, if you're going to be fighting in multiple ones in the same stance. So it's not as simple as, well, I step out of the way of their attacks and they miss. It's about thinking ahead. It's about constantly forcing you to adapt. How do I play this game in a way that, kind of, or how do I interact with this combat in a way that it makes me think, right, what's the best way to overcome this enemy? I want to bait them forward so they attack and therefore they're exposed so I can hit a weak spot, or do I want to, stand back because I've used all my attack cards and my stamina is done, so now I need to be able to avoid attacks, so therefore I need to, drop into a defensive stance and, move away from them so that way I don't get hit.
Yeah.
We've combined the whole experience into that. It is, as you say, it's a touch abstracted, but one of the things that's been really rewarding is everyone who's played it has said this feels really Elden Ring. It's unorthodox, but it's got the spirit of Elden Ring in it.
Yeah.
And as we were relatively nervous, because obviously one of the things you always have to be careful if you're designing anything is you're kind of, sitting around the table and you spent however many weeks and months and, months working on this thing and going off in that direction. You're like, it's not conventional. Sometimes you're asking people to make that step too far, like we can work it out. We've sat with it for months. Is anyone else going to enjoy it? But what's been nice is that people have touched this and straight away gone, this is amazing. We love this. Yeah. And that's been really, really, really rewarding, but also slightly relieving. There's a degree of relief there of like, okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because I like that some of the ways like the Dark Souls board game handled stamina, but I have to say when I was reading the Elden Ring one, I was understanding, pulling back into this stance lets you get more cards back, which is sort of related to your stamina, and it sort of is this really nice way of saying if you have more stamina, it sounds like you have more options and there's more things you can do, and that's totally true of the game. Is like, can you do a jump attack? Like you can't just like keep smashing your heavy attack. You have to sort of wait a moment, collect yourself, see what the enemy's doing. And I feel like that seems to come through from what I've been able to read from it. And yeah, I just think that sounds really cool. And like you said, it gets the feeling through without necessarily having to emulate strictly how the video game does, because at the end of the day, you're sitting around a table with some friends, you're not hooked up to the Xbox or PlayStation or your PC. So I think getting that experience through seems really strong. And I just thought it was a clever way to sort of manage that.
Well, I'm glad you like it. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I've seen people go, well, I'm just going to run forward and use all my cards to attack. I'm like, fantastic, go nuts. And they if you don't kill what you're hitting, it's pretty bad for you, because then you've got no way to mitigate damage. And it's Elden Ring. Things are lethal when they hit you. They just do a lot of damage, and if they don't kill you, you're not going to be in a good state. And of course, you're not resetting your health unless you rest at a site of grace and suddenly reset everything. And that's key. It's got that push-pull sense to it. And of course, the more that you waste time, and that we didn't necessarily touch this when we were talking about the objectives, but the Guidance of Grace cards give you objectives to fulfill. And as you're fulfilling them, obviously you're putting Guidance of Grace tokens on them, which mean that you're fulfilling them more narrative tokens, whichever way you're going. The more that you waste time, you use up this pool of tokens you have called the Greater Will. If you run out of Greater Will tokens, game over, because you've wasted too much time and the Greater Will has lost all interest in you and you're just another tarnished. It's not going to be Elden Lord. So it's something where I like the way you chuckle there. So the idea is that this is something where that's what we're driving towards. And so you can absolutely, if you keep on, spending all of your time fighting combats and not thinking about how to progress, if you're wasting time, then that's a bad thing for the game. We want it to be something where there's not a very, very strict time pressure where you don't get to enjoy it and savor the experience. It's more so much something where there's enough gentle course corrections as we go that say, hey, think meaningfully about what you're doing. Don't just run into combat and go, I'm just going to mash buttons and win. Like, you will run out of cards and then you will get killed. Think when you're exploring, don't just run off on a completely random tangent because you decide you want to be the first player to get 20 Herber cards, that sort of stuff. Don't be that person. Think about what it is you're trying to achieve, work together as a team in order to come together and do that.
And one other thing I was curious about, and I think it's one of the things that at least seems difficult to me, is how you manage sort of player progression in this sort of campaign thing, and also like how you get new equipment and how your build transforms. Like, what's the general like pacing or way around like how you get new stuff for your character?
That's a very loaded question with a whole bunch of different stuff in it. So that's a whole bunch of that. So I mean, the obvious one is to think about gear. Let's start with equipment. So equipment you're going to find as drops from killing certain enemies. You can trade with it with different merchants or the round table hold. You can find from searching sometimes various different bits and pieces. And as you find different armor, obviously that has more of a direct and obvious effect of simply making you tougher to kill, as armor has. Although we do have armor sets, so if you get all of the different parts of armor sets, then you get certain bonuses added in and so on. So there's there's something that's going to scratch your itch to go out and find all of those particular bits of, if you really want to be a Godric soldier, you can be. You can go find all the bits of armor or whatever else. But the other stuff is weapons, and weapons are interesting because not only are they upgradable to have stronger cards, and I'll talk to you a little bit how they work, is they give you a certain amount of attack cards, and you take all of the gear you've got, so you presumably your left hand, right hand weapons, although you can double hand a single weapon if you want to. And then that builds you an attack deck along with any ashes of war you equip to them. And that's basically the moves you can use in combat. That's how you attack anything else. So if you wanted to go, dual wield, run around with two swords, you absolutely can do. You have no defensive tech, you probably won't live very long. But the point is that you absolutely can do. If you want to, most commonly have the shield and the sword, it's a standard combo, or wherever you've got axe and so on. And you can do it that way, and that will give you your combat stuff. Now you can upgrade those cards by using smithing stones and the like to give yourself more effective, attacking tech. And of course, as you find new weapons, you'll take out the old cards and put in the new ones. So that way your deck is constantly evolving as you go. The other deck you're using in combat is the effect deck. And that's really where characteristics starts to really take effect. Well, cliche there, but yeah, that's where characteristics really start to show their strength. So for example, if we are running around with strength scaling weapons, then if I want to level up my effect deck, I'll probably level up my my strength as I go, cycle that stuff in, because then I'm going to flip more strength cards, which means that the weapon cards I'm using are more effective. I'm doing deeper damage or more effects from what I hit things, pushes around, smites or whatever else, that sort of thing. And that's really, staggers, that sort of stuff. And that's really how we build that sort of element into it. Now, how often that happens, and obviously there's other stats as well, but not to bog us down too much, how often that happens. So at the end of every session, you're going to sit down, and effectively it's a milestone system. So you are going to look at, hey, we earned a bunch of runes for what we did. So now at this stage, we can now play this, we can blast through, and then once we've actually finished doing all the actual quest is finished, we can now work out how to level up our characters. So we constantly have this point where you are finding new gear as you go along, and you can pause to rearm yourself if you want to. But in terms of actually improving your stats, in terms of improving your characteristics, that's going to happen at the end of every session. So you can then sit around, look at what all of the bits, look at holistically at all of the gear you found over the course of the quest, or look at all the different things you achieved and go, right, how do I want to be stronger? And then go from there.
The Souls games, and Elden Ring is no exception, are very flexible in how you build your character. And I was curious, like, I know that you sort of use the starting classes as a jumping off point, just like in the game, but are you sort of beholden to that? It sounds like from the different sort of equipment cards and stuff that there is some flexibility. I was just curious if you're trying to give the same amount of flexibility as in the games.
No, absolutely. There's a massive amount of flexibility. So that was something we felt very strongly about, because that's a big hallmark of what Elden Ring is this idea that you may start, with the Confessor or the Prisoner or whatever else, but if you just level up, that effectively is just where your characteristics begin with. If you want to level up different stats or whatever else, you absolutely can do, and the same is true of our game. So, let's say you start with the Astrologer. Well, if you want to give the Astrologer a strength-based weapon, then just start leveling up strength into your effect deck, then go nuts. You absolutely can do. It's the focus of what it is. Like, we don't gatekeep any characters from progressing where they might want to go otherwise. One thing that all characters do have is that all characters will have their own unique ability. There will be some unique quests for each of those characters. So when you start off, there's like a quest deck, and you'll take any cards that you've got, shuffle, that are unique for your character, shuffle those in, so that way you know that you're going to experience, let's say we're playing the Astrologer again, you will find the Astrologer quest as you go through the game, as you go through the campaign, they'll be in there. And that will unlock certain astrologer-friendly, equipment, for example, other bits and pieces. So there is some stuff in there that gives you that emergent narrative element that will obviously be dictated by what character you pick, as well as your starting trait, which kind of gives you a starting ability. Like, for example, the samurai can move diagonally on our battlefield grid. That's quite unique to the samurai. Which
Yeah.
means they're more mobile, basically. That's obviously something where it doesn't matter how you build your samurai, that will stay with them. So,
Yeah.
but there's bits and pieces like that which will dictate it. But in terms of actually how you level up and the gear you give them and so on, that does not, that's completely up to you.
Reading some of the pledge tiers and stuff, that there's some pretty exciting sounding stretch goal stuff. I was curious if you could expand on that, or if that's going to be a little teaser for as the campaign progresses.
No, I'm happy to give you this, and I feel you're probably one of the best placed people to, I think, probably appreciate this as much as anything. So one of the things we've always tried to do with our Kickstarter projects, and we always try to do, is Kickstarter is an endlessly interesting beast. It evolves, it changes, it moves around. It's very effusive in terms of how it actually works. And one of the things we always want to do is approach it from a very different perspective and just kind of look at this and go, right, how can we create something unique? How can we create something that's engaging for people? How can we involve people more with the process? And something which we first tried for the Resident Evil Kickstarter is a open world narrative campaign. Now, that's a very interesting set of words to add to a Kickstarter. But effectively, what we do is this Kickstarter will be a journey for our backers. So they will start off, we'll have a small piece of narrative, which we've made especially for this, which is, you are a tarnished, you've woken up. Where do you want to go? And you'll have a short piece of narrative where you can explore the world. And at the end, it will give you an A/B choice. And then at that stage, all the backers can vote in the comments where they want to go next. And the next day, I will be sitting there and I'll write a whole bunch of new narrative of where we've gone to. And at the end of that, the crucial point is whatever we find in that location we go, that thing will be added to your pledge. So you
That
have
sounds
effectively
awesome.
unlocked that and bolted it in. So if we say, for example, oh, let's go into this crypt. Okay, well, guess what? There's a whole bunch of skeletons waiting for us. Now everyone's got skeletons in their pledges
Yeah.
and that sort of stuff. Hey, there's a traveler on the road. Go talk to them. Okay, cool. And we'll add that traveler, whoever that may be, and so on. And that's the idea. That's what we'll be doing. We'll be going on a journey because we want this to be something where backers feel like it's their adventure, it's their journey. This is their Kickstarter as much as anything. We want people to be engaged and super excited about what they're going to find next, rather than literally just having a list of stuff where they go, well, I unlock this and then this and then this and then this, because that's boring. But why not get everyone involved, right? Why not get everyone
Yeah.
telling stories and talking to each other about, I think we should go over there. You mad? Why would we want to do that? That sort of stuff. I think that's really cool. And I really want that to be something experiential for people.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And as we're getting to the end, is there anything else you wanted to say as we're going into the campaign or about the game?
I mean, there's a whole bunch of different review bits and pieces now out there, but please, if you're a big Elden Ring fan, which I imagine you are if you're watching this, then please do come check out the campaign.
Yeah.
It's a celebration of Elden Ring. It's made by
Yeah.
superfans for superfans is the best way of saying it, and
Yeah.
we're insanely excited about this project, and I can't tell you how much we've all been looking forward to this for an awful lot of time, and we haven't been able to talk to anyone about it. So please do come and check it out.
Yeah.
Hang out in the comments, and as I said, like get involved in the exploration stuff, if nothing
Yeah.
else, because that's going to be amazing. So
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. I am probably going to go all in because I read the number of hours and I was like, that's as long as it took me to play Elden Ring the first time. So I have to do it. And I need that Godric model. That Godric model. The minis just
amazing,
look
right?
incredible. Like really, like
Yeah.
just the minis alone is enough to pull me like all the way in because that looks great. And then getting to do a cool organic campaign with it is just icing on the cake. It's definitely a celebration of Elden Ring. And thank you so much for taking some time to talk with me.
Oh, no worries. Thank you for having me. It's been
Yeah,
awesome.
thank you.